thank you very much for the invitation to do this, and obviously it would be very informal, and my topic today is looking at having a CPC project when you're in a large class, because we're very used to doing them with small groups, and making the transition to a larger group can be quite challenging. So that's what I'd like to talk about today. Some of the characteristics. I have a specific example from last spring, some tools to structuring these groups, how to keep the project ongoing and closing the project. So just to go through some of those, and please just ask or stop me at any point in time that you have questions. So we have opportunities and challenges like anything else. There are some great opportunities when we're working with this group. They get to learn how to collaborate with other people. They have opportunities for leadership. They get to take on a more complex project because you can break it down into smaller parts. So that does give them a unique experience they may not get in a class that's maybe 12 to 15. But it doesn't come out as challenges, right? Making sure people do have enough to do so that they feel they got something out of the experience. And that's something that was fairly successful last spring, but in looking at some of the post comments and reflections that students did, I know that wasn't 100%. Some students felt like they didn't have enough to really sink their teeth into. And you do have students who are taking it because it's required, and mine was in conjunction with a required management class. So students were taking it because they were required, so they weren't necessarily oriented toward doing a CPC project. Coordination and logistics. Now fortunately here, Arnold and Maya and Angela do a great job managing logistics, because I had 38 students in one class and 36 in the other. So to do the initial site visit, which I'll show you a nice picture at the end here, we had to get 2 buses and to be able to deal with meetings with the client, and then at the end of the semester doing our final wrap-up for them. So having all those people with those needs and meeting them is, gets to be a little exciting, but still rewarding and still a good thing. So I certainly would still do this again. If I had had a project appropriate for this spring, I still would have done it with those 2 classes. So, but I did not.
So what course is
it's
that?
Organizational behavior.
Okay.
So doing something like this really does work out well, because part of that class is learning how to be effective in an organization, and we know all organizations work on a team basis today, and needing those skills. So that's why I think this is really transferable regardless of your subject matter, because the students still have to learn skills that are going to be valuable to them when they graduate, and they still need to be able to work effectively with others. For some of them who are even underclassmen, doing something like this can even help them in their academic career as they start to get to some of their other courses that may have more project-based kind of work. So in this particular class, as I said, I had 2 sections of organizational behavior, and we were presented with a project from Coggeshall Farm Museum, which is right here in town. So Coggeshall Farm Museum is a working farm. They have native species of turkeys and chickens and cattle, so they very much operate in a real basis. And so I actually now have 3 students interning there, because they really liked the organization. So, but they have a small employee staff. They have an executive staff, and then they have some other staff. Some of them are seasonal. They have a large pool of volunteers. Some are long-term volunteers. They come every week to do things. Some of them are shorter term, and they have had our students go for their community service or a one-day thing. So they're dealing with a range of timelines here as they're trying to do their work. And they really didn't have up-to-date policies for their employees and volunteers. And as the students were going through them and reviewing them, they were so shocked at the state in which they were in, But as they got to know the organization more, they realized, well, this staff doesn't have the resources to do this work, and that's why they're here to have us do this work. So they needed all that revamping. So our class is able to do that for them. And we had one class work with employees and their issues, and the other work with volunteers and their issues. And they also determined some further needs, so they looked at some other areas beyond what Coggeshall had initially asked for. So they were able to enhance their own experience and give Coggeshall even more assistance than they had originally planned for. So if you're going to do a large class with these, creating a structure in the class to handle all that is extremely important. And that's something that I think really helped us to be able to work effectively. And I think it's essential if you're going to be with a large class to put some, not just order into the whole process, but meaning for the students as well. So when you're looking at the initial scope of work from the client, breaking it down into pieces that you can see being dealt with separately is really important. And this is all things that happen before you would take in the class. So putting that together, creating teams for each of those tasks. So knowing I'm going to have this many teams and these are going to be their tasks, and I'll show you an example of that. And having all that structure in mind. And then of course, integrating with your syllabus, because if you're not, this is a business class, but if you're doing another topic, you want to be able to integrate this work with the topic for your class. And then I see these other skills as being add-ons to whatever topic you're doing. So what I then did was I introduced the teams to the class. I went through a brief summary of what they would be doing and asked students to apply for a position on those teams. So the students could submit either a resume or a letter about why they want to be on a particular team, and they were asked to choose 2 teams because obviously, you get 20 students who want to be on one team and no students for another team, so you do have to manage the numbers. And having them apply was a way to do that. One of the teams is a project management team, and that's a team of 3 who are responsible for coordinating the efforts of the other teams. So they get a little bit more experience with managing a team function and developing their leadership skills, and it really helps the project to run more smoothly. And importantly, I think it takes you out of the equation a little bit more as the instructor. They're going to make a lot more decisions, and of course, you're going to check in, but they have a much more developed sense of self-sufficiency when they get to the end of the semester.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
The task groups, these are tasks that could all be completed at the same time? In other words, Team 2 was not reliant on Team 1 to finish their task before they could start?
That's a really good point. They all had tasks that they could do to some degree independently, but as they got closer to the end, for example, the students who worked on developing orientation for the employees needed to have the information from the employee manual available so they knew what to extract for that. But at the beginning, they all were able to start work on their own. And then later on, they needed to do some of that timing. So thank you. So these are the teams for the employee group. So we had one that worked on orientation, one that worked on training, one for continued training. So as employees became more experienced, how would you ramp them up and how would you give them more experience? Communications was an issue that they had. So they looked at various types of softwares that could be used that would be either low or no cost. So they had to work with those constraints too, which was really nice. The employee handbook, and seasonal staff who have different needs than the others. And then the project management team comes up with the task plan, a calendar, they reviewed the draft. So they had the overall coordination, which you need. I mean, that's all these people working together. Somebody has to know what's going on with all of them. So this was the other class, and what was nice about this is it did mirror to some extent what was happening with one, but it did necessitate meeting to be able to not have too much overlap. So like I had a couple of meetings with the two project manager teams, so they could kind of delineate what they were going to be working on. But they had a very similar type of structure, and the project management team had a similar set of responsibilities. So this way, every person in the class knew that they had a particular task to fulfill. And by seeing it initially this way, they also understood their fit with what was going to be happening with the rest. So having that structure, and then of course the content is what you need to manage from your own knowledge base in your own field. But this particular structure is just something that seems to support having all of these individuals trying to work together. So something that I have them do as they're considering which team they're going to apply for is to use this website, which it's an initial measure of what team role or roles you're most comfortable in, and there are 9 team roles, and it gives students feedback on which ones they are primarily interested in or skilled at, and what that means for them. So as they've applied for the teams, I'm going through and reviewing the applications, making the assignments. They're doing this at some point in time so that when they then get into their team, they can think about what role they should play at that point. So trying to just get everything organized at the beginning so that they understand the project place and their own place within that. So it's just, and they may not play that role in the end, but they know where their tendencies are. Are they someone that tends to be a leader? Are they someone who tends to be the person who makes sure the team morale stays up and keeps everybody happy? Are they the person who makes sure there's documentation of everything? So putting the student teams together at that point, reviewing the resumes or applications, trying to align them with a team that's going to reflect their sense of commitment. And it does help if you know the students ahead of time, which fortunately, we do tend to have that experience in our major. Does let you have a sense of when a team might need an extra person. Someone else might not be as strong, so you can do that. So I had the 6 other teams that have 5 to 6 students. A little larger than what might be an ideal size, but it did work out.
So did they have to give you their results of their team role test?
They did not.
Before you?
Not before, no. They did have to write a reflection about their results and what they thought they would lean to, but I did not include that at this point in time. So I just didn't. I think it was a time issue, because I wanted to get to the client as soon as possible, but I wanted them to be in their teams before we went to the client so that they could ask questions based on their area when they got there, and they would know what to do. These are some resources that I use just to give students an idea about how to have an effective team. There's a variety of readings. If anybody wants to have more of those, I have some of those that I use in class for them to just think about structuring team meetings and dealing with problem team members like a silent person or argumentative person and those types of things. This article I do require them to read this, and it's not very long, but it talks about using a team charter. And it does go through and talk about how that is used and why it's important and how it helps the team to function. Because you don't want to spend your time on this project. You want to be able to help the students in their task that they're doing. You don't really want to have to spend your time managing team dynamics. So you want to try to, I think, take that out of the equation as much as you can ahead of time. So, and I have this reading, if anybody wants that, I can certainly send that along. So at the end of this reading is the team charter. And once the teams are formed, they do go through and they need to work on all of these and settle all of these issues. Expectations get set ahead of time. It only takes them a class period to do this. It's not a long drawn out piece. They do have to come up with a team name, which creates camaraderie, right? Even though we all hate doing it. It's, you know, and I tell them that we all hate doing it, but it creates some nice energy. And this is where they're choosing their team roles. So whether, and I require them to have those three: a leader, who's the coordinator. So I try to emphasize this is not the person who does the whole team work. They don't write all the team things. They're coordinating, they're setting up meetings and making sure things get submitted. The scribe is a person who takes the notes and keeps track of those things, but they're not all responsible either for writing everything. And a facilitator I find really helpful to ensure that all the team members talk. Especially in some of the larger ones, I had 6 members, you're likely to get a couple of people who aren't going to really contribute. They're more introverted, they don't feel comfortable. So one of the outgoing people, becomes a facilitator, and they go around and make sure everybody is heard. So those 3 I find essential, but I did have students, teams set up, other people, mascot, cheerleader, researcher. So they created other roles that they thought would be important, and that was completely up to them. Their team goal, and because they knew what their team assignment was, they could work on that. Attendance expectations, so dealing with some of these like lateness, and if you set the expectations ahead of time, people are more likely to comply. And when they don't, as I tell them, this is your discipline. Person keeps coming late to team meetings, you bring this up and say, gee, we all agreed that we would be on time. How do you want to proceed with this? So it gives them a chance to make those rules and try to enforce them, okay, dealing with conflict. So, and these other pieces here, firing team members, I have not, in this context, I haven't had anybody be fired. I have previously, but in this context, I did not. So.
It's funny, Sue. I noticed the smoking break.
Yes.
It's an interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. Do they want to do that? Do they not want to do that? A few of them do. They're very clear. There is no smoking. There's no smoking around us. We're not having smoking breaks. We don't want to smell it. We don't want to deal with it.
Oh.
So people know, what they need to do before and after the particular meeting.
Just out of curiosity,
yeah.
How do you deal with it if somebody is fired?
So what I've done in other classes is they've had to do, in most of my classes I have large projects at the end, and they have to do the whole thing alone. So that's usually.
Do they know that beforehand? Meaning that's what
They-
they really want to do?
They don't. If they get fired, that's when I inform them. So some of them are happy about it,
No, because
Yeah.
I mean, not everybody likes to work in groups and stuff like
That's
that.
right.
I mean, I was one that didn't like to work in groups at all because I always felt that people don't do their part. And
Right.
I know you have all those roles, but
Right.
still, there's always still going to be a few
Yeah,
to fulfill.
there
your
are.
role.
You're right. You're right.
But you as the instructor knows who you're dealing with.
Right.
So you really know who is based on classroom.
Right. Right. And then some, I use the Google Docs for that piece as well, as far as doing their work. But you do, you know who's with it and who's not. But I don't tell them ahead of time because I think that might encourage some people to act out so that they could work alone. So, you always be thinking. The strengths and weaknesses I find helpful because some people are better at research, some are better at writing, some are better at public speaking, and so they're able to kind of gauge where they can make their contribution. And this they create in writing, and it gets posted on the Google Drive. So I did, and I had not used the Google Drive for this type of thing ever until last year. I had students share stuff with me sometimes, but I never used it. But it ended up being, what's that?
It's great.
It is great. It is great. So, so we posted, the teams had to post meeting notes. So, and they had to, you know, have action items and what they're going to do for the next meeting to kind of keep themselves going. Their final scope of work, which they had to sign off, and then the executive director at Coggeshall signed off on. Because I had done a CPC years ago where that wasn't clear, and it was really it wasn't the most satisfactory ending that we would have liked. So this went much better in doing it that way. And so we had all the content created, and I could determine participation. So let's see here, I did have it open. Let me just go back. Okay, so with this project, so we had the volunteer teams, the employee teams, and then there was some common content, and everyone saw the final scope of work for the whole 2 classes. So everyone knew where they were and, you know, where some of the commonalities might lie. So everybody had access to that. So I just want to show you one of these teams and what their documents were. So these are all the teams within this particular class, all the employee teams.
Was it a year ago today?
I'm sorry?
Was it a year ago today?
Yes, it was. It was. It's funny. When I was looking at it yesterday, I was thinking, I said, oh, it's going to be a year ago. So there must be some kind of a fate thing going on. I don't know. So I'll bring up the 4 seasons. So if you go to their team meetings, and it's not like they had a lot, but they documented what they did. So everybody had a sense of being able to move forward. So they had their draft as they worked on their scope of work, their piece of the final presentation, and one of the things they put together was, and this is something that wasn't part of the original scope, but they wanted to have a feeding schedule because as volunteers came in for different seasons, the feeding schedule was different. And this way they wouldn't have to take time every day reviewing that. They could just send the volunteer to the barn, they could do the stuff and move on. But what was nice about this is I could go through and see who had commented, who had not ever put a comment in, and I used that as part of the participation grade for the class. So, and the students didn't know ahead of time that I was going to do that. And I did remind them a couple of times during the semester, you know, this is part of your participation grade. Make sure you're weighing in on all the documents and putting that all together. So they did go through and work on that. So they had their final scope of work that they put together. You know, the task, they wanted to go back and meet with the client and create the feeding schedule, laminate, so they went through all the steps they had to do, due dates, and the project managers had access to all of these. So the project managers were able to look at all of the teams, making sure that their progress steps were going to be in line with when the class was going to need those particular deliverables. And then, you know, all the sign-offs happened. So
is this what you did like every class session? The teams would meet, or did they meet outside of?
Sometimes they met outside. I usually would use part of a class each week for the teams to be able to meet. Yeah, since, you know, a lot of second semester seniors, and they're everywhere but in class, so they have other things going on. So, you know, we would make some time in class for that. And during that time, the project team would go to each of the teams also, get some updates. And they were also able to catch when two teams were starting to do too much that was the same. So they were able to look at how they needed to split that work out. Sometimes I was involved, sometimes I wasn't. But they really gained a lot of ability to manage their own issues. You know, how can we split this out so we're each doing something well? And then within the teams, you know, that people are fulfilling what has to happen. So, you know, one of the challenges is you have your own class things too, right, that you need to take care of with this large group. So, you know, doing all that, you know, type of scheduling. So, but I think having the team structures, I would say, is a way that you can manage having all of these people working on a project. Otherwise, you know, who knows what their responsibility is, or what's the calendar like, or, you know, I think it's very difficult to do. And before doing this last spring, I was hesitant about jumping in with classes of that size. Yeah, because it did seem kind of overwhelming. But that's why I think using this structure really helped it to be manageable and effective. Let me go back to what I had here. Okay. So everyone created, all these teams created content. So we have the team that they made the employee manual. We had the team that created an orientation and training program. And actually, they went ahead and created training videos, which initially the client wasn't into. They did not like it at first. They didn't want to do that. They wanted to have everybody in a classroom setting. Bless you. But I have since found out that they've implemented a couple of those, you know, since that time. They also did. They did, you know, the research I was saying about the communication systems, and they went over there and helped them set them up. So they're able to communicate with their employees and volunteers on the site through their phones without having to have people, because they were using a task board in the main office, and people would have to keep going back and forth to see what had been done, and if the last person didn't cross off what they did, somebody else went to do it and it was done. So these systems let them go ahead and do that.
Was the videos the same scenario? It's like they weren't thinking they had the equipment to watch videos, and that was kind of like the reason why they wanted to do that at first?
They felt
because they're probably thinking, oh, I need a computer to watch a video. Not necessarily their phone, too.
Right. That could have been one of the restrictions. I'm not positive, but that could have been one of the restrictions. And they also, they were very used to the idea of a classroom training for those people as they came in. And they weren't sure if they could get their points across that way. So it was interesting. So at the end, of course, I looked at the content too, so I wasn't going to let it go to a client unseen. But I really didn't have to worry. They really did quite a good job. But the project managers were assigned with looking. So the project managers, when you're talking about the scheduling of tasks, Daliani, the project managers started out with less day-to-day that they had, but toward the end, because they also reviewed the presentation. So at the end, they had more tasks that they ended up doing as we were wrapping things up. So at the end, coordinating the closing out of everything. So we had all the different documents that we put together. CPC put together, they made all the photocopies and put everything together in a nice package. And we did do 2 run-throughs of the presentation. So we did need, so that was one of those logistics things, right? We needed a room. We needed it for a good amount of time because we had 12 different groups presenting. So we needed a lot of time, and then refreshments and things like that to keep people engaged and awake, because we had to do it during an evening so that students weren't, they couldn't come in the middle of the day and do it, and the clients either. So putting that together. But what we did is, and this did take some class time because of the numbers, we did run through the whole presentation twice. So they ran through it first. The project team was more tasked with giving the feedback, but we really did it. Everybody did, and people were very good at spotting. Well, this really, when you said this, it wasn't clear, or you don't need to read the whole slide, or there's misspellings on the slide, and so really did contribute to making it a better product. So in that way, having a large group was really helpful because it's so many different perspectives, and people were able to make note of things that stood out to them. So they ran through, they made their corrections, and then they did a final run through in class before we got to the client point. So one of the challenges we had there was the transitions piece, because now you had to take these separate pieces and knit them back together. And that wasn't assumed. So sometimes we assume that students are going to know that that needs to happen, but that was one of the areas I found was not as clear, that they needed to think about segueing through the presentation. And the project managers were very helpful for that in providing some of the continuity to everybody. And they did do a reflection at the end. They did do a reflection on the experience and what they learned. And they really were two-pronged. In one sense, they got a much better appreciation for how nonprofits operate and what their needs are, and how dedicated people are to work in that environment. And on the other was their own skill development. So being able to present, or being able to do more writing, or being able to become more knowledgeable about HR, kinds of things. So, so that was really interesting to look at. And the executive director and volunteer director actually cried at the presentation. They were so happy to have all this done for them. And that really hit the students too. They did, I didn't expect it either, but they were just blown away. So it really made the whole experience worth it. So
hopefully some of your students will bring those reflections over into their LinkedIn profile or their professional portfolios.
It's a very good point.
I think that is a huge plus for them in
I
applying
agree.
for positions, because this is experience. This is real experience,
Right.
And especially
Right.
for the project managers who have to deal with all the people
Right.
issues and the deadlines and all of the challenges that come with running a team.
Right.
That's putting them way ahead of a lot of other students who are just graduating without that experience.
I did try to emphasize that as much as possible, particularly at the beginning, because there were students who felt like, this is a class, and now you're putting this in the class. But trying to talk about the fact that this is a real thing that you can put on your resume here. You're really using your skills, and it's not just. And it wasn't just their business types of skills, but their writing, their communication, their ability to research. All of those things came into play. So, they really benefited from that, I think.
It's a big group of students.
Yes, it is. That's our site visit. So, So, yeah, they enjoyed all the chickens, and it was
I wonder
kind
how
of,
many of them, because you had seniors, had
Yes.
ever been to Coffee Shop.
none of them.
None of them.
None of them had ever
So
been
right
there.
here in town, they've
Yep.
never gone.
Nope. Nope. But now I had a student who interned there over the summer, another who did the fall, and two or three. No, two of them now. One's architecture, but the other two are management students. So, yeah. So they've really been able to expand on their work. So, thank you very much. Any questions? Anything else you can think of?
I was wondering, you talked about like determining the teams before the students got there.
Mhm.
Can you talk a little bit about that? And in this particular circumstance, it seemed like it worked well to have one class of employees, one class of volunteers.
Right.
But I could imagine some projects might not divide that.
That's right.
equally.
That's right.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you might imagine sort of those moving parts where you had students in two different sections that
Yeah.
needed to be more integrated.
That's a good point. I think what I would do in that case is look at the process that you were trying to complete. And in that case, I would stagger it. I think I would use one class to do the initial research and setup and get the foundation of the project, and then I would have the other class be the completing class. So it might enable you to do more content with one group at the beginning of the semester, and then more content at the end of the semester with the other group. But they would still get the experience of seeing a whole progression of a project, and the challenge there might be having the project management teams making sure they really coordinate, so that you'd have that flow from the early work to the next, because you certainly wouldn't want the early people to feel like their work gets
Right.
abandoned. And your other question was on putting the teams
Yeah.
into structures. So looking at the scope of work that the client brings in, it's really disassembling it yourself and thinking about how you would see those parts, and just putting in enough where you have one or two sentences for each team about their goal. So they have a general sense, but it also allows them to have some freedom to fill it in and do more with it. And then as you talk to the client too, sometimes you find you have that's the other piece I didn't mention here. You have the capacity to do more for the client than you might with a small class. So it could let them get into some other directions they might not initially. But that would be a way, I think, to structure them.
Did they actually create like manuals?
Yes,
And
Yeah.
so they did the graphic design and all of the
they did.
printing? Good.
They did, and they redid their the volunteer section of the website, and they developed a volunteer survey, so they would know why people volunteered and when they would tend to volunteer, so they could go back to those pools, and everything was done both. Well, they did a Facebook page for them too, and they set it up and they trained them and set it up in a very simple way so they could keep it, keep it going. And the manuals they also did electronically, and they did them just in Word, so they could make any changes. Yep, update easily, because that's the other piece with the nonprofit. Of course, you don't have the staff to create, and you often don't have the staff to maintain. So they had to think about, that was one of the issues that they met with about the staff. How would this be able to be maintained, because they don't have time to do that. So, but yeah, they did. They actually they came up with some really nice graphics too. I mean, the way it was really, I have to be honest. I mean, their creativity was really impressive when they kind of got to show their skills. And there were people on the team who were graphic design concentrators, and other people who were communications concentrators, and you know, they could all play a role, and they had that expertise that they could lend, and you know, because they could feel good that they could use their own unique skills. So that was really nice. Okay. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. So.